Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive paradox in modern computing. We're going to figure out why technically fast computers often feel, well, frustratingly sluggish. And more importantly, we'll look at how one highly tuned Linux system completely flips the script on this issue. We're pulling from some seriously fascinating notes and real-world data shared by a Linux enthusiast known as PP4MK. Okay, let's get right into it.
Look, we've all been there, right? You build or buy a machine, your hardware specs are absolutely off the charts, yet your system still hesitates when you click. It pauses, it stutters. You've got gigabytes of RAM and a blazing fast processor, but opening a simple web browser feels like you just asked the computer to solve some complex physics equation. So why does this actually happen? The root of the problem is what our source cleverly calls the benchmark illusion. As a tech community, we are totally obsessed with terminal numbers. Disk speeds, CPU benchmarks, boot times. But here's the thing. Human beings don't experience a computer through a terminal output. We experience human sensations. We care about how instantly the desktop reacts to us. We care about window smoothness and app launch speed. We just want the system to get out of our way. And that brings us to the holy grail here, perceived speed. This is the subjective experience of how responsive, instant, and fluid a system feels to you, the user, completely regardless of what the raw synthetic benchmark data says. For a desktop operating system, our source strongly argues that this perceived speed matters infinitely more than just raw numerical data. The source material really hits the nail on the head with this quote. A system can be technically fast and still feel slow. Because despite having fantastic hardware, without the right setup and optimization, you might still experience those maddening microstutters and lag. You might still find yourself sitting there waiting on the machine instead of the machine waiting on you.
Section 1. The RAM-first revolution. So this revolution comes to us via a custom setup called XFCE FUSILLI. It was built by PP4MK, a developer who actually spent years believing a totally different system, EasyOS, was unbeatable for responsiveness. But after months of tuning, they shifted their entire paradigm to a RAM-first workflow. Instead of constantly hitting the solid-state drive, this setup aggressively caches the file system directly into memory. We're talking near-zero swap usage and minimal disk rates, all running on a super lightweight XFCE base with FUSILLI compositing to keep things visually smooth. And the sensory result of all this aggressive optimization? Absolute instant gratification. As the developer notes, Firefox launches in a blink. You click a heavy application like a modern web browser, and it just opens, in a flash. There's zero hesitation, no microstutter, absolutely no feeling that the computer is thinking about your request before it actually does it. Let's move on to Section 2, the proof. Real data, not theory. To see how this magic actually happens under the hood, let's peek at some empirical data from a tuned Intel i5 system equipped with 11 gigabytes of RAM. Out of those 11 gigs, a massive 7.3 gigabytes are aggressively utilized just for buffering and caching. Linux is practically pre-warming the entire system, applications, libraries, desktop themes, the whole shebang, right there in the RAM. And the commitment to that RAM-first philosophy is absolute. The swap usage is exactly 0 bytes. None! Instead of letting RAM sit there empty and wasted while leaning on the storage drive as a crutch, this setup is turning all that memory into raw, immediate speed. Everything you might need is already warm and ready to go. When we zoom into the application level, it gets even cooler. Memory-heavy applications are actually running partially straight out of the system's ultra-fast RAM. For instance, Firefox is pulling 397 megabytes, and the SlimJet cache is utilizing 45 megabytes directly from memory. You aren't constantly hitting your storage drive every single time you load a new page or pop open a new tab. All right, let's slow down for a second, because what we're about to see is hands down the most shocking reveal regarding what the system's solid-state drive is actually doing while you work. Think about it. If everything is loaded into RAM, what exactly is the hard drive up to? Absolutely nothing. Measurements taken with system monitoring tools show the SSD dropping to exactly 0 megabytes per second in both read and write speeds. It practically goes to sleep. While you're actively using the system, the physical disk almost completely stops working. And because that disk almost completely stops working, this setup effectively transforms your standard desktop into what the source calls a pseudo RAM-OS. By keeping the SSD totally idle, it virtually eliminates the primary storage bottleneck that causes all those frustrating microstutters we talked about earlier. Which brings us to Section 3,
Why feeling fast matters. There's a deeply psychological layer to all of this, largely driven by the Fusilli window manager. Because speed isn't just about data pathways, right? It's about human perception. First, Fusilli adds these beautiful fluid transitions and visual continuity to the desktop. Second, this significantly reduces any perceived visual lag when you're switching between tasks. And third, your brain literally interprets that unbroken visual feedback as raw speed. Even if the backend terminal numbers perfectly matched a traditional setup, the fluid visuals trick your brain into feeling like the machine is way faster. When you put a typical Linux desktop head-to-head with XFCE FUSILLI, the contrast is wild. A typical desktop has high SSD dependency, FUSILLI has almost none. Visual smoothness jumps from just medium to very high, and app startups go from average to completely instant. It's a deliberate smart trade-off. FUSILLI uses moderate RAM utilization in exchange for aggressive caching. And the overall user sensation? It shifts from merely functional to an absolutely premium feel. Ultimately, the developer concludes that while traditional setups remain technically brilliant, this whole journey proves that an operating system absolutely must prioritize desktop pleasure. As the source beautifully puts it, Linux doesn't only need to be fast, Linux needs to feel fast. It's really about how the system honors your time and your attention. So I'm going to leave you with this. Look at your own machine today and ask yourself a serious question. Are you just chasing synthetic benchmark numbers, or have you actually optimized for the human experience? Is your system just technically fast on paper, or does it actually feel fast under your fingertips?